For nearly 2 decades, Nicole Kidman and Keith Urban were Hollywood's golden couple, a picture-perfect union that seemed to defy the industry's relentless curse on love. She was the Oscar-winning actress whose elegance commanded the screen. He was the country music superstar whose charm and devotion made millions believe in forever. But behind that calm, polished image, cracks had been spreading quietly, invisibly, and fatally. When Nicole finally filed for divorce in late September 2025, the world gasped, not because marriages fail, but because this one wasn't supposed to. They were the couple who always smiled through rumors, who appeared hand in hand at every red carpet, who spoke about love as if it were a sacred, unbreakable promise. Yet, as papers surfaced, citing irreconcilable differences, the illusion of stability dissolved overnight. In the days that followed, Kidman's public silence spoke louder than any interview could. No statement, no accusation, just absence. The kind of silence that carries weight, the kind that makes people listen. Sources close to the actress described her as betrayed but poised, a woman trying to protect her daughters while standing amid emotional wreckage. It wasn't rage that defined her, it was the quiet dignity of someone who had finally seen too much. Keith Urban, meanwhile, was photographed performing without his wedding ring. The symbolism was sharp and deliberate. He sang, but something in the music had changed. The song "The Fighter," once an anthem of their devotion, was suddenly gone from his concert setlist. The audience noticed, the press noticed, and the message was clear. This was no temporary storm. But for Nicole, this wasn't just another Hollywood heartbreak. It was a reckoning. For years, she had carried the emotional balance of a marriage that often tilted unevenly between fame, temptation, and self-doubt. Friends recalled her deep commitment, her willingness to forgive, to rebuild, to believe. Yet, as one insider whispered, "You can only fight for love alone for so long." In private, Kidman reportedly confided in close friends about feeling emotionally isolated, that despite their fame and fortune, there were nights when she felt utterly invisible. Those close to the couple suggested that the distance between them wasn't born of one single betrayal, but of 1,000 small ones, the kind that accumulate quietly until they smother the light that once held two people together. Still, Nicole Kidman's story isn't one of destruction. When she finally decided to walk away, it wasn't out of bitterness, but out of survival. She had spent a lifetime portraying women who endured pain with grace, and now she was living that truth off-screen. For the first time in years, the actress wasn't playing a role. The media wanted scandal. What they got was something rarer: truth told through silence. In that silence, Nicole Kidman did expose something. Not Keith Urban's secrets, but the quiet devastation that lives beneath the surface of even the most beautiful love stories. It was the end of a marriage, but the beginning of her reclaiming her own narrative. Long before the headlines screamed "divorce," there were whispers, soft, persistent, and often ignored. To the public, Nicole Kidman and Keith Urban were a storybook fantasy, their love painted in gold by the tabloids and their smiles polished by cameras. But to those who watched closely, the signs had been there for years. Behind the photographs of laughter and clasped hands lay something far more fragile: exhaustion. Marriage, for them, had become a stage one they had learned to perform on flawlessly. Nicole, the consummate actress, knew how to smile through heartbreak. Keith, the musician, knew how to turn pain into melody. But even art has its limits, and real life doesn't take direction. Friends of the couple had often noticed the subtle distance, the way she stood, half a step behind him on the red carpet, or how he avoided her gaze when questions turned personal. There were rumors that Urban's long battle with addiction had resurfaced during quiet moments, that the couple's time apart for work had grown into something deeper than physical absence. Nicole had once said in an interview that Love takes courage every single day, but courage, like faith, erodes when tested too often without renewal. Sources close to Kidman described years of emotional imbalance. While she anchored herself in stability and routine, Urban thrived in chaos and spontaneity. She sought silence after a day on set. He sought the roar of a crowd. And in that difference between quiet and noise, stillness and storm, their bond began to thin. It wasn't about scandal. It wasn't about betrayal in the tabloid sense. It was about loneliness inside love. Nicole, who had once been consumed by the heartbreak of her divorce from Tom Cruise, had rebuilt her faith in relationships through Keith. He was the man who had waited for her outside rehab, the one who promised redemption, the one who sang love songs to her on stage. But even redemption stories can falter when one heart heals faster than the other. As the years passed, Kidman poured herself into motherhood and work. Her performances in Big Little Lies and Being the Ricardos carried the same emotional truth that seemed to elude her personal life. Observers began to wonder if her art had become her therapy, a way to process what she couldn't say at home. By 2024, her schedule had become relentless, filming across continents, raising 2 daughters, balancing public image and private exhaustion. Urban, meanwhile, continued to tour, living a life where applause drowned out silence. The physical miles between them mirrored the emotional ones. What began as a few weeks apart became months, then seasons, then something unspoken. Disconnection. When they did reunite, the warmth had cooled. Conversations turned polite, rehearsed. The laughter that once came naturally now required effort. Friends noticed that they no longer finished each other's sentences. Nicole, once radiant beside him, seemed distant, thoughtful, almost rehearsed in her affection. Keith, always the showman, leaned harder into performance, his music increasingly about heartbreak and resilience, perhaps too close to home. In interviews, Nicole began to speak about resilience and emotional endurance in ways that felt more personal than professional. "We all have moments where the world feels heavy," she said. "What matters is how we rise after the fall." It was the kind of line that sounded poetic until you realized she was speaking from experience. By the May, she quietly moved out of their Nashville home. Few knew. There was no argument, no public spectacle. Just a woman who had spent 19 years trying to keep love alive, finally deciding that survival was no longer the same as happiness. Keith Urban's world changed too. He was said to be devastated, but understanding. Friends claimed he never saw it coming, though perhaps, deep down, he had felt it all along. The music stopped being about love and started being about loss. For Nicole, the hidden cracks had finally split wide open, and instead of patching them again, she chose to walk through them into whatever truth awaited her on the other side. When the announcement of their divorce became public, Nicole Kidman didn't give the kind of explosive interview the tabloids were hoping for. There were no accusations, no late-night confessions, no sensational memoir pages ripped open for public consumption. Instead, what she offered was something far more calculated and far more revealing. She let grace do the talking. Her first appearance after the news broke was at a film gala in Los Angeles. She wore black, her hair swept back, her face calm, yet unreadable. Reporters shouted questions about Keith Urban, about betrayal, about rumors. Nicole smiled politely, nodded once, and said simply, "So many times love runs its course, and that doesn't mean it wasn't real." It was a single sentence, but to those who had followed her career, it said everything. The performance was over. In the following weeks, Kidman began appearing in carefully chosen interviews, each one measured, each one threaded with the quiet power of someone reclaiming her narrative. When asked if she felt angry, she answered, "No, anger is heavy. I've carried enough." When asked about Keith, she said, "We had beautiful years, But not all beauty lasts. Those words, soft, almost whispered, carried the weight of 1,000 pages of unsaid truth. What made people listen wasn't scandal. It was honesty wrapped in calm. For years, she had played women who suffered in silence, who endured heartbreak behind closed doors. Now, life was imitating art. But there was a difference this time. She wasn't acting. One particular moment became the unofficial exposure the press was waiting for. During an interview promoting her upcoming project, The Silent Ones, Nicole reflected on emotional neglect. "It's possible," she said, "to be deeply loved by someone and still feel unseen. Love without presence is like music without sound. It looks beautiful on paper, but it doesn't fill the room." To many, that was her confession, not of scandal, but of truth. She didn't accuse Keith Urban of infidelity or wrongdoing. She exposed something quieter, something more devastating: emotional absence. In that one metaphor, she summarized what countless women around the world understood, but rarely articulated: the loneliness of being with someone who's physically there, but emotionally gone. The reaction was immediate. Fans flooded social media with empathy, calling her words a masterclass in dignity. Critics praised her for transforming private pain into universal reflection. Even some of Urban's fans admitted that her tone was not bitter. It was freeing. Meanwhile, Keith Urban's concerts took on a melancholy tone. He began to perform stripped-down versions of his songs, often with an air of remorse. During one show in Chicago, he paused between songs and told the audience, "You don't realize what you have until it's too quiet to hear it anymore." It wasn't an apology, but it was close. Insiders revealed that Nicole had turned down multiple offers to write a tell-all memoir about the divorce. "She doesn't need to shout," a friend told Vanity Fair. "She's letting the silence do its work." That restraint, so rare in a culture addicted to exposure, became her ultimate revelation. By not naming faults or sins, she made the story bigger than just one man and one woman. She turned it into a parable about the fragility of love under fame, the weight of maintaining perfection, and the quiet courage it takes to walk away without burning everything behind you. In the months that followed, Kidman's words began to take on a new texture: less sorrow, more self-possession. She told The Guardian, "I'm learning that peace isn't found in someone else's eyes. It's something you build when the noise stops." And in that sentence, perhaps more than any accusation, she completely exposed Keith Urban. Not as a villain, but as a man who couldn't give her what she had always needed: presence, stillness, peace. It wasn't revenge, it was revelation. And it was delivered not in anger, but in truth's quietest form. When the storm of headlines began to fade, Nicole Kidman did what she had always done best. She transformed pain into art. While the world speculated about her private wounds, she was already turning them into fuel. For Nicole, survival was never about denial. It was about creation. Every heartbreak she had endured, from her tumultuous marriage with Tom Cruise to the fragile, crumbling quiet of her years with Keith Urban, had taught her one enduring truth: the only way out of the darkness is through it. In early 2026, Kidman returned to the set of her new series, The Glass Hour, a psychological drama about a woman trapped in a perfect marriage that slowly disintegrates. The parallels were impossible to ignore. "It's not my story," she told Vanity Fair with a half-smile. But pain recognizes pain. On camera, her eyes carried a depth that felt lived in, the kind of emotion no director could fake. Off camera, crew members described her as calm, methodical, like someone who's finally stopped running. For Nicole, this was not a comeback. It was a resurrection. Gone was the anxious need to protect an image. She no longer played the perfect wife, the untouchable star. She allowed herself to be raw, vulnerable, imperfect. In doing so, she unlocked a new kind of magnetism, one born not from glamour, but from truth. her closest friends began to notice a shift. She spent more time at her home in Australia, away from the flashbulbs, surrounded by family and ocean air. "She's lighter now," one confidant told People. "It's as if she exhaled for the first time in years." Nicole took up painting again, an old passion from her teenage years, and began producing short films through her company, Blossom Films, focusing on women's resilience and emotional recovery. The transformation wasn't sudden, it was deliberate. Nicole understood that reinvention requires sacrifice. To become who she was meant to be, she had to bury who the world thought she was. Even her wardrobe seemed to mirror the shift. The woman, once defined by red carpets and haute couture, began appearing in simple linen dresses, barefoot in interviews, laughing easily. "When you've lost everything you thought defined you," she said, "you finally meet yourself." Her daughters, Sunday and Faith, became her anchor. Nicole spoke often of how they gave her purpose during sleepless nights. "I want them to see that heartbreak doesn't destroy you," she told The Guardian. "It refines you." That sentence would later trend online, captioned beneath a photo of her smiling against the Sydney sunset. Meanwhile, her work began to carry a new emotional gravity. Critics hailed her performance in The Glass Hour as her most hauntingly human to date. One review read, "Nicole Kidman doesn't act pain anymore. She wears it like a crown." As for Keith Urban, the distance between them remained respectful, though unbridgeable. He released an album titled Echoes of Us, filled with songs about regret and lost love. Fans couldn't help but hear Nicole in every lyric. She, however, chose silence once more, not out of disdain, but understanding. "People grieve in their own key," she said softly when asked about the album. "His is music. Mine is silence." The reinvention wasn't about revenge, nor was it about image. It was about reclaiming authorship of her story. For too long, Nicole Kidman had been the supporting character in other people's narratives, the devoted wife, the muse, the enigma. Now, she was the writer, the director, the voice. Her transformation became a cultural moment. Women across the world cited her as proof that you can begin again at any age. That reinvention isn't failure, it's evolution. By the end of that year, Nicole stood not as the ex-wife of Keith Urban, but as a woman reborn through fire and reflection. Her pain had become poetry. Her silence had become speech. And through that quiet power, she reminded the world and perhaps herself that sometimes the most radical act of love is choosing yourself. By the time the dust settled and the gossip cycle moved on, Nicole Kidman had done something few in Hollywood ever manage. She had turned heartbreak into philosophy. Not revenge, not spectacle, but reflection. In a culture obsessed with exposure, she made restraint the new rebellion. And in doing so, she redefined what it meant to survive the end of love. In interviews that followed, Nicole spoke less about Keith Urban and more about herself. "I don't think of life in chapters anymore," she said in a conversation with The New Yorker. "There isn't an end or a beginning, just movement. You either grow or you stay." That statement summed up her entire arc. She hadn't walked away from a man, she had walked toward herself. Critics, feminists, and fans alike began to see her not just as an actress, but as an emblem of female self-possession in an industry that thrives on emotional consumption. Young women cited her as a reminder that grace is not weakness, and that silence can roar louder than any scandal. The very thing the tabloids had mocked her for being too composed, too private, too cold, became her power. In one of her most intimate interviews, Nicole reflected on how fame had shaped her marriages. "When you love someone in this industry," she said, "you're not just loving a person, you're loving a shadow. You have to decide whether you can live with the parts that never belong to you." That quiet line pierced deeper than any accusation. It was her final truth about the collapse, not that Keith Urban had failed her, but that fame itself had devoured what they tried to protect. Even her former colleagues spoke about the aura that now surrounded her. "She walks into a room and you feel calm," said director Jane Campion. "She's been through fire, and it shows, but it doesn't burn anymore. It glows." That glow became her new trademark, not the youthful radiance of red carpets past, but the settled light of someone who has made peace with imperfection. In the art world, her evolution resonated as a creative awakening. Kidman began financing independent films about resilience, loss, and the search for meaning. Her choices no longer chased awards or box office success. They pursued truth. "At this point," she said, "if I can't feel it, I can't play it." That authenticity, rare and raw, became her legacy far beyond acting. Keith Urban, for his part, remained respectfully silent. His music continued to echo regret, but never bitterness. Observers noted that despite their separation, neither sought to diminish the other. It was a kind of peace that only comes from love once real, now released. For Nicole, the lesson was simple yet profound. Love is not defined by permanence, but by presence. The marriage may have ended, but the compassion she showed in its aftermath revealed something eternal. The ability to love without possession, to let go without hatred, to speak truth without cruelty. Her journey became a meditation on freedom, not the freedom of rebellion, but the quiet liberation that comes when a person stops trying to prove, defend, or hide. "Freedom," she told Vogue, "is being able to sit with yourself and not feel the need to explain who you are." And in that, Nicole Kidman offered the world her final revelation. The true exposure wasn't of Keith Urban, it was of herself. Stripped of roles, stripped of illusions, standing in the full, unfiltered light of who she had become. She had entered marriage as a star. She left it as a woman. By the middle of 2026, the world had moved on. New scandals rose, new stars burned, and the endless carousel of fame kept spinning. But somewhere between Nashville and Sydney, two people who had once shared a home, a life, were quietly learning how to live again. For Nicole Kidman, the silence that once felt like grief had turned into a kind of music. Her mornings were slower now. She woke before dawn, made tea, and watched the sun rise over the ocean. There was no schedule, no red carpet waiting, no pressure to appear composed for anyone. "Peace," she told Harper's Bazaar, "is not a prize you win. It's a room you learn to build inside yourself." She had stopped reading the articles, stopped tracking what Keith Urban was doing, stopped revisiting what was already gone. Instead, she began to fill her life with the small, tender rituals that fame had once stolen from her, cooking dinner for her daughters, tending a small garden, reading poetry before bed. There was a gentleness in her voice that hadn't been there for years, as if every heartbreak had been sanded down into wisdom. Keith Urban, on the other hand, returned to the road. His latest tour, Echoes of Us, wasn't the thunderous spectacle of his earlier years. It was stripped back. Fewer lights, smaller venues, longer pauses between songs. Audiences described a vulnerability in his performances, a sense that he was finally singing to be understood, not adored. "I lost a great love," he said one night, voice cracking between verses. "But sometimes losing love makes you find yourself." The tabloids tried to revive the narrative, "Will they ever reunite?" But the truth was simpler, and perhaps more beautiful. They didn't need to. There was no bitterness left, no drama, no fire, just two souls who had traveled through the same storm and reached different shores. When asked if she still believed in love, Nicole smiled. "Of course," she said softly. "Love doesn't fail. Sometimes it just finishes its work." Her answer wasn't sad, it was serene. It carried the tone of a woman who had seen the full spectrum of what love can do: ignite, wound, and ultimately heal. In an unexpected turn, she and Keith were seen together briefly at their daughter's recital that winter. There was no tension, no visible awkwardness, just two parents sitting side by side, applauding, sharing a quiet look that said everything words could not. Those who witnessed it described it as the calmest reunion imaginable. By then, Nicole had become something more than an actress, more than a former wife. She had become a symbol of endurance, not because she avoided pain, but because she faced it without turning bitter. Her silence, once mistaken for coldness, was now recognized as wisdom. Her restraint, once criticized as detachment, was now seen as strength. In a final interview before retreating once more into privacy, she said, "I've learned that endings are not failures. They're punctuation marks, they let you breathe before the next sentence." And so she did. Keith Urban kept touring, his music now quieter but truer. Nicole Kidman continued acting, producing, mothering, living. Their worlds, once intertwined, now ran parallel, no longer colliding, yet forever linked by what they had shared. Between them stretched not resentment, but silence, and in that silence lived a rare kind of peace. It was the sound of two hearts that had finally stopped breaking. There comes a point in every love story when the camera stops rolling, the music fades, and only silence remains. It is in that silence, not the applause, not the headlines, that truth finally breathes. For Nicole Kidman, love was never a failure. It was a lesson written in light and shadow, a mirror reflecting both the beauty she gave and the emptiness she endured. She once said that acting was about revealing humanity, but in the end, it was her life, not her roles, that revealed it most. She learned that devotion without balance becomes exhaustion, that forgiveness without change becomes surrender, and that sometimes walking away is not the end of love, but its most honest expression. Keith Urban will keep singing. Somewhere, in some quiet corner of the world, his songs will still carry traces of her. A tone, a lyric, a memory he cannot erase. And Nicole, in her films, will continue to explore the quiet corners of the human heart, those spaces where pain turns into poetry and silence becomes the language of survival. May has softened what fame once sharpened. They are no longer the golden couple on a magazine cover. They are simply two people who once shared a dream and outgrew it. But if you look closely at the way she smiles now, unguarded and at peace, you'll see it. The light that remains. Because love, real love, doesn't vanish when the vows break. It changes form. It lingers in the lessons, in the music, in the children who carry both faces. It becomes quieter, purer, almost sacred. And as Nicole Kidman steps into the next act of her life, she does so not as someone who lost love, but as someone who learned how to keep it differently. The applause has faded. The stage is empty. Yet somewhere, between the end of one song and the start of another, there is still the echo of two hearts that once believed in forever. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough.